people who are out there who really need us, then we will be there for them. So I'd like to move along and introduce our panelists. First off, we have Kim Foxx. We are lucky enough to have her as our Cook County State's Attorney. She's the first African-American woman to leave the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the second largest prosecutor's office in the country. Kim was elected on December 1st, 2016, on a message of reform, restoring trust, and being responsive to the community that resonated throughout the county. She previously served as Chief of Staff for Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle, where she was the lead architect of the county's criminal justice reform agenda to address racial disparities in the criminal justice and juvenile justice systems. Kim holds a BA in political science and a JD from Southern Illinois University. I'm also lucky enough to call Kim Foxx a friend and know that she is a tireless advocate for not only criminal justice reform, but also addressing the issues that matter to the African American community the most. Again, thank you for being here, Kim Foxx. Next we have Shari, President and CEO of the organization that you guys happen to be sitting in right now, the Chicago Urban League. Shari is a native of Chicago. She's been an active part of the city's civic and cultural life. She is passionate about the importance of inspiring youth and empowering African American lives. Established in 1916, the Chicago Urban League works for economic, educational, and social progress for African Americans and promotes strong, sustainable communities through advocacy, collaboration, and innovation. Shari leads the strategic planning, development, programming, and community outreach for the Chicago Urban League, one of the largest of the 95 affiliates of the National Urban League. Thank you, Shari. In addition to making sure that we answer the questions that are presented by the audience, we also want to make sure that, again, our responses are solution-oriented. So I would ask that in each of your responses, both of you include at least one solution to the problems asked. First off, I'm going to allow for opening remarks, and we're going to start with Kim Foxx.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Sorry. As Amisha said, the issue of gun violence and its impact on the city of Chicago is the most pressing issue, certainly of my office and particularly of the city and county right now. Just to give you some context of where the facts are, last year in 2016, there were 764 people murdered in the city of Chicago, and there were more than 4,000 shooting victims, 4,000 shooting victims. And this year, sadly, we are on pace to match that. Most of the homicides that we saw were perpetrated with guns, and they were perpetrated in public spaces. The facts we know, and there's a, I don't know if the word is resignation or just a common acceptance, and that we have way too many guns on the streets of Chicago, way too many illegal guns on the streets of Chicago. The reality is that Chicago recovers twice as many guns as the city of Los Angeles and nearly 5 times as many guns as the city of New York. 5 times. And we are the 3rd largest city, and by big margin. And the violence disproportionately impacts young men of color. African American men aged 15 to 34 represent 4% of the city's population, just 4%. But they're 50% of the homicide victims that we see. 50%. And in 2016, 45% of homicide victims were between the ages of 20 and 29. And these are all devastating, but is gut-wrenching is the fact that 19% of them were between the ages of 10 and 19. Mm-hmm. So, though that's the statistical narrative of where we are. Putting statistics aside from a moment, when we're talking about this and we're looking at solutions, we are all impacted by this gun violence. As Amisha said, we are all impacted by this gun violence. Just today, I had the unfortunate task of speaking to a mom whose son was murdered 2 weeks ago by gun violence. And I was speaking to her not just as the state's attorney, but as someone who went to college with her and knew her I know this young man's father. This is actually the second of personal friends of mine who have lost children to gun violence since I've been in office. And so when we have conversations around what's happening with gun violence and the notion that it's only impacting small segments of our community, we need to dispel that narrative, that all of us are directly impacted by the loss of life that we see in our community, the residual trauma that is imposed on the communities that are enduring the violence on a regular basis, and we have to be more proactive in our response to dealing with it. Now, as Amisha said, I am the second largest prosecutor's office in the country, and historically, prosecutors' offices respond to violence. We do a very good job of responding to what is brought to us. But if our only recourse when we talk about solution is dealing with people after they have been killed or shot, we are losing the game. We are losing. And so we have to engage in meaningful strategy around violence prevention, around investment in those activities that work to steer young people away from violence. And I talk a lot about young people because there are young men who are dying. We cannot rest on law enforcement. And I see our men and women of Chicago police who are here, who are out there every night doing what they can to help stem the tide. But this is not a law enforcement issue. And I want to make sure that the conversation that we have tonight when we're talking about solutions is not a you should do this versus what we should do. We have to look at this truly as what it is. It is a public health issue. It is a neighborhood and economic development issue. It is an education issue. It is a mental health issue. All of these things combined. And if we wholly focus on what law enforcement is doing or not doing, we will continue to only respond in the aftermath. And so, when we talk about, these are my opening remarks, but I'll throw out a solution from the very beginning, is that we have to meaningfully engage across sectors, wherever you are. If you are in the education space, we need you to work with us as we develop strategies to deal with, for example, issues of suspensions in schools. What we know when we look at juveniles, when we look at those who have either been shot as juveniles or who have been shooters, a good portion of them have been disconnected from schools. The question is, when we see that these young people are disconnected from schools, what are we doing? How are we responding? And so the piece that we have from local school councils or the work that folks are doing around education has a direct impact and correlation on the violence that we see. So, I will leave it there as part of the opening statements, but the statistics are grim. And they will continue to be grim if we only have a reactionary approach to violence. If we are only waiting for the criminal justice system to fix this problem, we will continue to lose many lives and, quite frankly, many generations.
Thank you so much. And Shari Runner, I know that you have a lot to say on this topic, that this is something that has mattered to the Urban League for years, and a very focal point for not only the Chicago Urban League, but the National Urban League as a whole, considering what's happening across urban communities as it relates to gun and gang violence and what we can do. You've taken on a lot of work here, making sure that not only the Urban League is involved in the community, the Urban League has a voice in the community, is training up future leaders who can activate around these issues. Right now, I want to hear from you about some of the things that you're doing, as well as some of the solutions that you feel are necessitous.
Well, thank you. First of all, Amisha, thank you for being here, and thank you, State's Attorney, for being here. I think this is a conversation, while it is had over and over again, we cannot talk about it too much because we have to find some way to solve the issues in our city. And recognizing that our city is not unique, but it is oftentimes highlighted as a place where this is the major problem and this is Chicago's problem, but that's not true. And so for all of the reasons that the State's Attorney outlined, in her remarks. I think one of the things that we know as a provider on the other side working with youth who can be called anything from disconnected or opportunity youth or disengaged or whatever, we know that they are our youth, and our systems are failing them in a number of different ways. And so the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis is to be with these youth and help support them and help to provide them with options that will take them away from whatever other things they might get into as a result of the communities, the lack of resources in the communities in which they live. And so that's very important to us because we like to, at the Urban League, highlight the fact that 100% of our young men and women who we work with are graduating from high school. 100% of them are going to college. 100% of them are getting employed. Yet and still, just this weekend, one of them was shot, and in fact died today. And so with all of the work that we do, and as much as we try to make sure that our youth have options, we know that the environments in which they exist and how they live, we cannot save every single one of them, and that is frustrating. And in fact, and frankly, it should be, all of these statistics that we talk about. These are real people. These are real youth. These are real families. These are real things that are happening in our community every single day, and we cannot continue to because as much work as the Urban League does, or the state's attorney does, or any number of different organizations around the city do, the problem is so big in terms of trying to get your arms around it that it sometimes seems like it's unsolvable. And we have lost generations of youth, which means that we've lost generations of people who will be productive members of society to this kind of systemic racism and the issue of how our city operates. So it's very, very important that we not lose sight of the fact that these are real people living in real circumstances, and it's all of our responsibility to do what we need to do in order to change this trajectory.
Powerful words. Recognize a few people in the room before moving on to questions. First off, Chicago Police Department. We are forever grateful for your service. Secondly, Dr. Selwyn Rogers from the University of Chicago. As many of you know, the University of Chicago now has a trauma center, and he's going to be leading it up. So, on behalf of the South Side of Chicago, thank you for being here. The first question is for you, President Runner. Gun violence in Chicago is more prevalent in the communities on the south and the west sides. These communities have historically been lax. They have historically been left behind when it comes to economic development as well as jobs. How can individuals take more control of their personal economic destiny to help balance this historical imbalance and support pathways to economic opportunities for the greater community?
So I think the big question, the big answer there is recognizing history and not negating it and not ignoring it. When African American people migrated north to the city of Chicago, they were led to certain areas in the city of Chicago, and those areas at that time provided. When you escape from Jim Crow and come north, it's a matter of what's worse. But here there were jobs, and here there were communities that were built and allowed African American families to develop and lead. So there were stockyards, there were steel mills, there were all kinds of economic opportunities for people to participate in. As as with a number of different things, which we call systemic, redlining, reverse redlining, block busting, all of those things, those communities were eventually somewhat destroyed. They initially started out with businesses. They initially started out with capacity for people to build lives and to create and gain wealth. When the city of Chicago deindustrialized, those communities started to be destroyed. And so we have to think about what did that mean, because what happens when the intergenerational transfer of wealth does not occur is people are going to have to find ways to support their families and support themselves. And so we've seen over and over again the rise of illegal markets, illegal economies that support drugs and guns, and not necessarily for African American people, but for in African American communities. So it's important that when we think about how people are going to support themselves, where does that start? So it starts with education. We need to have the education that allows us to get the jobs. We need to have the jobs so we can support our families and don't have to depend on illegal economies. And it also depends on creating and maintaining wealth in our communities, and we can do that. So it's very, very important that we understand that those are the key factors: education, jobs, and wealth transfer for our communities.
If I can jump in on that.
Absolutely.
In addition, I think the historical context absolutely matters, because when we talk about the narrative of what's happening in these communities, the notion is that these communities destroyed themselves, when we need to talk about how they were created and sustained or not sustained. In addition to the redlining issues, we also had issues related to public housing. As I say everywhere I go, I am a child of the projects. I grew up in Cabrini. And what we had in public housing, particularly in Chicago, was concentrated poverty. And when you look at the factors that one evaluates in looking at risk levels for violence, concentrations of poverty absolutely play a factor. And one of the things that we saw, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, when violence, what we're feeling right now is and should be uncomfortable, we saw even more heightened levels of violence in the 70s and 80s, particularly around our public housing stock here in Chicago. And then there was the notion that we were going to disband public housing. We had this renaissance, this vision of we will disband public housing. And there are a couple of things that we need to take into stock. You had these isolated areas that were choked off from other resources and economics within that very community. You had folks who were living in those communities who were not being given the skills and the resources to be able to thrive and develop. And the services or schools and all were all fairly concentrated right in the walls of those projects. So whether it's Robert Taylor or whether it was Cabrini or the Ickeys, everything is in this area. So then what happens when you tear the buildings down and you've had networks and communities that had lived for generations in the same area, and you fling them far and wide across the county with, again, in areas, some that were doing better, and not giving the opportunities that should also come with it, or the access to services that should also come with it. And so I think it's really important that we add that texture to it, because what we've seen is that some neighborhoods that had not been as impacted by violence years ago are now seeing upticks in violence now. And the narrative that, well, the project people have come and destroyed our neighborhoods also needs to stop, particularly in our community where we're turning on one another, particularly those who have been marginalized, and saying what has been the impact of policy. And the policy discussion cannot be undervalued. And again, I say this as I'm a lawyer, I'm a prosecutor on the back end. But if we don't take a deep dive look in the policies that got us here, whether it's education or housing or economics, we will be doomed to find solutions to these issues, whether it's sentencing policy or reactionary policy, where we still have the conditions that lead to violence. When we look at the neighborhoods that are most impacted by violent crime, they also are the same neighborhoods that have the least economic development, the highest unemployment rate, some of the most underfunded or under-resourced schools, and a lack of public health and mental health services. That is not by accident.
Right.
And so if our response to that is simply to address one piece of it and not talk about those other pieces of it, we're going to continue into this cycle. So from a solution standpoint, one of the things that we have to look at, we have also in these neighborhoods high concentrations of folks who have come out of our criminal justice system. So all of those conditions, we have people who have been arrested, whether it was for drug sales or drug possessions or robberies. Because you have high incidence of crime in these neighborhoods, you have then generations of men and women who are coming out of the penal system and moving into the exact same neighborhoods without the opportunity to contribute because jobs aren't there anyway for those who haven't been there. So we have to make more investment on those who are returning from the corrections facilities. It is a matter of prevention, investing in reentry, and people look at reentry as the end point of it. But if we aren't making sure that those people who come back from prison have an opportunity to contribute to either get an education or to work, we know that the recidivism rate will continue to rise. Because if you cannot work, if you cannot find a way to provide for your family, there is a higher likelihood, and you come out of prison, that you will go back at the expense of crime to someone else. And so we have to talk about all of that, particularly as it relates to economics, of making sure that we have policy that allows for people who are returning from prison to be able to contribute financially in our economy, because to not do so will continue to see the declines that we see in these neighborhoods.
And this is why when we look at laws that look to raise the rate of or the ability to put people in jail for the possession of a gun, we have to be very careful, because it sounds like law and order, and it sounds like it's going to do something that's better, but it's actually adding to the incarceration rates of young people that probably don't need to be in jail, and they will probably be at some point at risk of going back into the system.
Absolutely. For those who are following us on social media, also we want you to stay engaged in the conversation on there as well. We do have a hashtag for this event. It is hashtag Foxx, 2 X's, at CUL. Make sure you're using it to carry on the conversation. Again, hashtag Foxx at CUL. Before we go on to the next question, I want to make sure everybody has been given a card because we want to make sure that you guys get your questions answered during the Q&A session. To touch on something that you said a moment ago, State's Attorney Foxx, when we're looking at the issues that have amassed in a way to cause this ripe area for gun and gang violence, when we're looking at lack of economic development, housing instability, a lot of the schools being underfunded in minority communities, those aren't issues that are solely Chicago issues. Those are issues that we see in urban communities across the country. When we look at Chicago in 2016, 2016 ended with more killings in this city than New York and LA combined. A lot of people point to the influx of accessibility of illegal guns in the city of Chicago. Why are illegal guns more accessible here than they are in other places? And what options do communities have to help reduce illegal gun trafficking?
I think what you've seen in Los Angeles and New York have been deliberate, proactive strategies to go after gun trafficking. This is a conversation I think Shari and I have every time we see each other. Every time we see each other. And because it's confounding, right? If you have more guns than New York and Los Angeles combined ×2, the question becomes, what are they done differently? Now, we do have a geography issue. New York has some very, very strict gun laws and have been surrounded by states that also have very strict gun laws. But they also have what we call an iron pipeline, guns that were coming from the South, from Georgia, from Tennessee, from Florida, that were coming up. but they were also strategic in going after and partnering with not only federal authorities, but authorities in other states to work collaboratively to go after those who were trafficking guns into their state. What we see in Illinois is we all have kind of the resignation of what everybody knows, Indiana has lax gun laws, and they do. But the question becomes, so what does that mean? How do we then respond? Just earlier today, I had a meeting with the special agent in charge for the ATF, who's been on the job since November of 2016. And we were saying, how do we have a strategy that goes after those who are trafficking in guns? If our only strategy is to deal with the gun possessor, the end user, it's too late. And we talk about, and we talk about the correlations when we talk about the drug epidemic back in the 80s, right? When we were going after those who were using crack, but we knew, or cocaine, that it wasn't being produced in the places where it was being used the most. And you look at gun violence, and we have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds with guns. We know that children that age don't just get guns. There is some profitability by the deaths of our children from people who are making money infiltrating our communities with guns and no strategy to go after them. And that's the problem. And it's easy to go after end user. It's easy to go after the person who's possessing. We have to have a more aggressive strategy to go after those who are trafficking in guns, who are profiting off of the deaths of children. So one of the things that we did, talking solution, right? Keep talking solutions. We had a state RICO law that had been on the books since 2012 that was set to expire, that we lobbied in the General Assembly to continue. RICO is a federal statute that allows for prosecuting agencies to go after those who are engaging in a criminal enterprise. So not getting the person at the lowest level, but those who are driving it, who are profiting from it, and using the resources to build strong, long cases. Some of these cases, and where the frustration comes, takes a long time to build. That's why it's easy for us to get people who have gun possession, because it's over. I caught them, they have it, I can say that you had the gun. Finding out who is it that's behind the jackings of the freight trains that come through Inglewood, and they're taking rifles off of trains and then putting them in the hands of gangs, that's what we need to be doing. That's where we need to use the weight of our office and prosecution to go after those. Because we have young people who are being used as pawns to go and scout out, and we can catch them all day long for being over that fence. But we are not catching those who are employing them to engage in that activity. So we're going to be using that law to build longer cases, to work with our federal partners. We're working with the Chicago Police Department in the 7th and 11th police districts in partnership with the DEA, the ATF, the U.S. Marshal's Office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office to build stronger gun cases from the beginning. People ask, why are you just there? Those are our two most violent districts in the city right now. We're piloting this. Our attorneys are in those police districts. They have desks there. They're not in offices at the state's attorney's office so that they can get real-time intelligence. But that's what we have to do. We have to start thinking strategically. New York has a gun strategies unit. That's where I stole the idea from. Los Angeles has a gun strategies unit. We didn't have a gun strategies unit. We had a human trafficking unit, which is huge. We have an issue with human trafficking. We have an issue with gun trafficking, and this office had not devoted its time, resources, and energy to go after it, and that's what we're doing now.
So, Kim, if I can call you Kim. Yes, she's not joking. This is something that I talk to her about all the time. I think this is one of the most important and ignored things about the issues that we face in terms of gun violence in the city of Chicago. We have 6 of the 7 national railroads coming through our city. We have a water port. We have an airport. We are within one day's travel of 70% of the people who exist in the United States. And that is why we are a transportation hub. That is why businesses locate themselves here. Legal businesses locate themselves here because they want to take advantage of that. And so those other businesses, the human traffickers, the drug traffickers, and the gun traffickers also know this. And that is why when people shake their hands and try to create Chicago as being this Wild West, horrible place, it is because we are who we are. It is because we exist in that environment, and we need to acknowledge that. And as Kim has said, this is something that is not going to be solely solvable by the police force in the city of Chicago. It is a national problem, and it is something that needs to be tackled by a larger group, which includes federal resources. So this is very, very important for us to recognize. And unfortunately, when you think about guns and when you think about drugs coming through our communities, they're not necessarily they are not necessarily only being used in African American communities, but those communities are the hubs for that industry. And unfortunately, what we've seen, especially this summer, which I think is something that we should all be very aware of and concerned about, is the use of those guns is seeping outside of these communities. And so we're seeing shootings on Michigan Avenue, and we're seeing shootings all over the place because these guns are available to any and everyone. And so if we want to talk about solutions, this is one of the biggest ones that we have to pay attention to and think about. How do we stop guns getting into our city, and who is it that's making money on this, and how do we stop them from continuing to make money on the backs of our communities?
If I could speak just for a second. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening.
Can you stand up? I'm sorry.
Sure can. State's Attorney, President Rounder, everyone.
You didn't call me Rounder, did you?
He said
Runner.
Freudian slip.
Just real quickly, all due respect and praise for both of these women and everybody in here. The issue, at the beginning they said, one of the things the attorney said and the president said, that everybody has to be involved. My mother, and by the way, whatever I say is what I'm saying, not Chicago police. So, but my mother and father said back, I'm a 70s baby. My mother and father back in the day said, when Shaquana, Taquita, Marquisha had babies, this day was going to come. Babies cannot have babies. And we have it out here. The attorney said, policing, legal, it's not going to solve it. It'll curtail it, it may, but it's not going to solve it, and this is going to happen. And see, it's more so an issue now. One of the reasons it's an issue because it's affecting everybody. Not necessarily white, Asian, but it's affecting people, and it's out of hand. Nationwide, and in Chicago, obviously. Everybody, bless you. Everybody in this room should be packed. That's part one. That's a traffic sound for anybody saw. This room should be packed. This building should be packed. And it's not is an issue. You have, the way I police, and my partner, I police, I get out the car. I know some of you may have seen me on the street, but that's me. I have to do that because that's in my heart. Outside of police, you have to do that. You have to get on your nieces and nephews and do that. Attorney, president, you have to, because if you don't get out there, you don't make other people get out there, we don't, as a community, don't get out there, stand out there and say, you're not going to do this, you're going to keep having these discussions. This doesn't make any sense to have this discussion. I mean, does any Asians having this discussion, whites having this discussion, their communities, anybody else? They're talking about taking over again. The attorney just said to you is that it's an economic issue and it's it's an issue who bringing the guns in. That's not the issue really. If that's the issue, that's a problem. We talking about that. Is any other community of power talking about the issues that we got to? No, they're not. I'm going to leave with this. All due respect, attorney. I'm so proud of you. So proud of you, President. But this has to be took serious. This is a serious issue. I wrote a letter real quick to Senator Durbin when the Darion Albert. Everybody remember Darion Albert? When we did that again to ourselves, by the way. We did that to ourselves. So when that happened, I wrote a letter to him at that time. I said extreme solutions require extreme problems require extreme solutions. I wrote to him, I said, honestly, Senator, if you want to solve, let's say, the crimes that happen, you need to lock up the parents, custodians, with them somehow. Because if you don't, or charge them somehow, because it's not going to stop. Somebody's to be accountable. You had this baby, you're not raising them, you're going to somehow be accountable for that. Father and mother. Thank you very much, attorney. Thank you.
If I can respond for a second, because I hear you. And I think there's two things that we, particularly as African Americans, need to do. One of the things that I always do, I tell people I'm a child of a teenage mother, her second baby at 18. And so I hear you that my father and I are cool now, but I didn't know him most of my life. My brother had done some things that got himself in trouble. My mother was not a bad mother. She did smoke weed on a regular basis. But my mother was also diagnosed with depression. We had no facilities for which she can go get proper treatment. I grew up in public housing in the 70s and the 80s when the murder rate was twice it is now. And so this isn't a new problem, it's ongoing. And if we start having a conversation that is only about things not associated with bad schools, I see one of my grammar school classmates here. I didn't go to school in Cabrini to be able to do the things that I was able to do.
Preach.
I went to the school in Lincoln Park in Old Town where they funded it better and they taught me Spanish, English, French, and German. We don't see some of the same issues in those same neighborhoods that you talk about, not because we are poor of spirit, but because the systems have been working for decades, centuries.
Come on, Cal. Come on, Cal.
So, yes, we do need to stand up as a community. We do need to say that when someone has a gun, when one of our babies are shot, when we see somebody running in with some new stuff, my brother could never show up with some new gear on, and my mother like, where you get that from? We broke. You got that from someplace else. There is that policing that we have to do ourselves, but let us not get caught in the mindset that this is simply only an issue of bad parenting or bad people. Because if that were the case, I am a 70s and 80s baby too, 1972 project baby, single mother, and I am the state's attorney of Cook County. What I know is that the things that made a difference for me were investments in my education, the opportunities that I had that were not given to others. And so we have to, and I get emotional about it because I see us doing it. And we do have to hold parents accountable. Your kid's not going to school and he has a higher likelihood or she has a higher likelihood of getting shot or hurt. We have to intervene. But we also have young people who have watched classmates murdered and have no treatment to deal with what that looks like. That is a real thing. We have classes or high schools where 4 or 5 kids have been killed, and we're asking 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds to respond with the mindset that isn't to protect themselves by getting out of it, but protect themselves with the guns that are easily available. So we have to make sure that conversation where there is that self-responsibility and accountability that we have to have, but I am not magical. I did not end up being a state's attorney having come from the project because I'm special. I had opportunities that other people just like me didn't get and ended up in our criminal justice system as well. So I feel compelled, all due respect, because we do this together. The kids that I see at 12 and 13 who are in our criminal justice system and the parents who I see come through in the generations that we're watching, if it's just they better get their act together, we're going to continue to lose people by the generations.
I will not race shame. I will not race shame. This is not an issue of race. This is an issue of poverty and systemic policies that have created the environments that we live in as a majority. So no, I can't state it any better than Kim just did, and so I won't even try. But I know that there's one thing that we need to start to do, and that is to change the narrative. The narrative must change about who and what we are, what a resilient people that we are, how we can continue to achieve and live and survive despite the obstacles that are put in our way. And what we need to do now, and what we have continued to try to do, and in fact did in the 50s and 60s, but have seen those gains erode, we need now to start to be actively involved, to vote, to make sure that our elected officials are held accountable, and to do the things that create the policies that make sure that our people can thrive, not survive, thrive.
Without a state budget, how do we reach these types of solutions? Because the things that you guys mentioned in terms of moving our city forward, moving the Black community forward, if we're talking about education disparities, housing, all of these things require funding. And right now, we just do not have it. CPS is going bankrupt. There's new news coming out of that place every day that is not happy for any of the students or the families. And we know that steadily the Black population in this city is decreasing, not only because of the murder rate, but also because a lot of people are moving.
Yeah, so I think that's very important. And again, this is something where we need to hold our elected officials accountable. And I wasn't joking. I don't want to be called Rauner. I don't want to be called Madigan. I want those people to do their jobs. I don't care what it is that they come up with, but something right now is better than nothing, because the lack of a state budget, to your point, Amisha, is on the backs of African American and brown people in the state of Illinois. And it's crucial that a governor who ran on an education platform is allowing educational institutions to fail. How can that be healthy for our city or for our state? It makes no sense. And so we must demand it. And so it will demand going back to marching and not allowing those people down there in Springfield to sit and not vote on something that we know is critical.
And I think it's a matter of life and death. I think there's an urgency to what's happening in Springfield that I think needs to be articulated in more than spaces that it is right now. I mean, we'll see the people who are impacted by, medical cuts, or, they have a debilitating illness and their services have been cut, and they will go and they'll see it. But what we're seeing in the neighborhoods, with the lack of funding for social services, for some of the safety nets, for some of the programming that we see, it is not simply coincidental that as we started to see these issues downstate, that we've also seen an uptick in the violence. And when we uncouple it, when we let people off the hook because we don't talk about the real impact that it has, what's happening is allowed to happen because it's the power structures down there, but there has to be an urgency from us about what's happening here. And it's not just because we're a laughingstock as a state, but really because lives are being lost as a result of that. And so, we have to, the state funding issue is a problem. A lot of folks are relying heavily on foundation dollars. Some of the concern that we see, when you talk about solutions, is we have a lot of organizations that are doing things, perhaps they're not coordinated, and they're trying to feed off of the same dollars. The fierce competition for limited resources means that we're not getting everybody that we need to get. And so in these times of trying to make $1 out of 15 cents, that means we have to start coordinating our efforts, coordinating our resources, and not being territorial about who we serve or who we won't serve, because the issue is we need the services. And in as much as this may take another 18 months for us to figure out, providers and neighborhood folks have to step in the gap. We talk about philanthropy, where we really need to step up our game as African Americans is in the philanthropic space. We need to really be putting our money and our dollars where our mouths are. That it's the state, we absolutely need them, but we also need some of the wealth that we've been able to incur to invest that back into the communities that we live in. And so I'm not optimistic that the issues in Springfield will be resolved as quickly as if it were impacting other communities. To your point, Amisha, the Chicago public school system is, I think, over 90% children of color. To the point that was made earlier, some of these suburban school districts that aren't having this conversation also aren't having schoolhouses that don't have books. And when we talk about the disparities that we see in that funding and education, that's where we're seeing an impact. So we have to be urgent about this. We have to be urgent and force the hands of those who we've elected to do their jobs.
I had a meeting with a few state leaders at the Union League Club yesterday, and one of the questions that came out of that was, what do we do as a community to get more people involved who don't look like us? Because right now, the people who are out front talking about gun and gang violence, the people who are organizing these types of meetings, all of them are black people. How do we get the rest of Chicago, the North Siders, those on the North Shore, even if we look in this room, when there are like 4 people or not, the majority of people look like us. How do we get people outside of that to care, to actively engage, and push just as hard as we are?
I think that it takes intentional conversation. It is easy for us to preach to the choir. So we can be here tonight and we can talk about the issues that concern us and that impact our communities. But one of the things that we're doing as an organization is making sure that we broaden our reach. And so intentionally talking to people who have conservative values, intentionally talking to Republicans, intentionally talking to all races of people, because you know what? The fact of the matter is that not all black people, we're not monolithic, and we don't all think the same way.
Right.
And we need to start having these conversations with people who don't necessarily think like us. And the divisiveness and the tenor of conversation that has been resulting from our last political season has infused us with no way to talk civilly to each other. And we have to make it a point to do it and to have civil conversations with people who don't believe the same things we do.
And I think some of the conversations are being had by folks who don't look like us, but we're not asking them to be a part of the solution, right? So when we talk about the economic impact that the violence is having on the city, if I'm a corporate leader who wants to move my headquarters here and all you hear in the news is about the violence, there is a concern. They are concerned. Not just if you see, blood spilled on Michigan Avenue, but how do you get people to want to come here if the narrative is all bad? If the narrative is you'll have to pay for private schools for your children, if the narrative is you can't go south of Roosevelt.
Right.
Like there's a real issue from an economic standpoint that requires a cross-section of folks having a conversation. I think when we're asking them to engage in the conversation, it's also a piece of they want to know what can they do. We started this conversation of what does solution look like? Because we talk about economics and education and mental health and public health, it feels very daunting. And at the same time, the competing narrative of this is self-defeating behavior by a group of people who we can't change behaviors, we can't change people, what do we do? And so I think we have to, one, meet people where they are. I find, particularly on the issues of criminal justice, even with our most conservative folks, the fiscal impact gets people to the table. When you talk about the dollars and cents that are involved in the bottom line, people want to engage. And I think there is, at this point, I believe, a real willingness for others to participate and do something about it. The question becomes, what is the doing? And how do we articulate how they can be meaningful? Because there is a fear of speaking out on issues that's happening on the west side if you're from the North Shore, that people aren't gonna take you seriously. And we have to make sure that we make room for them, and have an ask. And so I think there's a willingness to do that, but we have to, one, give the space to do it and have real tangible things that we're asking for them to do as well. But I think it starts with the fiscal impact that violence has on all of our communities.
We have quite a few audience questions, and again, I'm going to ask the person who submitted to actually stand. So for those of you who are brave enough to write your names on the card, I would ask that you stand. First one is Armisha Jones, and the question was, how do you respond to the stiffer gun laws that Superintendent Eddie Johnson just successfully passed in the state?
Go ahead, Shari.
I think that they're wrong. I don't think that there's any evidence to prove that putting someone in jail for possessing a gun actually reduces the amount of crime, or that it stops people from getting or having guns. I've told the superintendent that, I've told Senator Raul that, I've told a number of different people that I think that that is not an evidence-based solution for the gun problem that we have. And we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that we have too many guns in the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois generally. So I am against those laws. I am against minimum sentences, and I don't think that they're going to solve the problem that we're seeing.
So I will say, the 764 homicides that we saw, somebody pulled the trigger on those cases. And on a lot of the cases that we see where someone has been arrested later, they have a background for having had a gun in their possession. And I agree with Shari that we have to be mindful, that when we have blanket mandatory sentences and we treat a person who will wildly go shoot up the block the same way that we treat someone who's trying to protect themselves out of real fear, that we have a risk of swooping up everybody. But I also know, just from the work that I do, that there is a segment of our population who engage in gun crimes and come back repeatedly. And we have to have some measure of accountability. What does it look like? Having the discretion to be able to go higher? We should, because not everybody deserves the same level of empathy. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. We have 12-year-olds and 8-year-olds. We have children being murdered. And these guns aren't shooting themselves. And so I want to be clear, for all that I talk about in terms of economics and education and the factors that lead to it, it is inexcusable to take another life. And we can talk about the factors that lead to it, and we can factor all of that in, but we cannot allow for a culture that has people who harm us to not be held accountable. But I think we have to be mindful of what that accountability looks like. And we shouldn't get comfy and cozy believing that the solution is, well, if you treat everybody this way, that'll make us safer. And because that's not it. That's absolutely not it. But so I'm always mindful, that, look, we should have, judges have the discretion to look at these cases. But I'm also mindful that some people don't believe fat meat is greasy until you pour that grease up on them. But I only believe that you do that in those instances. Somebody said, you do that in those instances where it's merited. And I think that's part of why there's this we are where we are as it relates to incarceration, is that if you treat everybody like they're the most dangerous person, nobody is a dangerous person. So we have to make sure that our policy aligns with what the reality is. And I agree with Shari. We also have to make sure that we have the evidence and the facts to support it.
Can I just ask a second question? Yes, Armisha Jones, Near North Unity Program. I love you both. Awesome what you're doing. But I also want to come back to mental illness you addressed. When you're dealing with the kids and the shootings, and they're closing down the mental the clinics, and then they're undiagnosed. So then we have to, when you say evaluate and analyze, the ones that belong in jail, belong in jail. I do agree with that. But at the same time, if we don't assess them, we might let the ones that really need the empathy slip through.
That's right.
So then how do we do that? How does it look when we do an evaluation? Yes, you had 3 guns, we caught you, you're ready to go. And 7 years, 7 to 14 is where the law applies to you. However, we never said he had a sexual abuse when he was younger. He missed his mother and dad when he was younger. As he got older, the gangs embraced him.
Right.
So now we have a person that we didn't help.
Right.
But now he did the dirt, 7 to 14. So how does that look like when we come with rehabilitation?
Yeah.
And the ones that do deserve, they still need to have some sense of analyzation to where you belong. Maybe you get your services in jail, maybe.
So I think that's, one of the great facts about the opportunity that we have Dr. Rogers here to talk about mental illness and public health and how it relates to our communities, because what we know is that our jails are being used as mental hospitals in certain cases, and we need to recognize and acknowledge the fact that our communities, because of the violence, it is now a public health issue. It is not an issue just solely of the violence that is being committed by people.
Thank you so much.
That's why we talk about trauma too, right? So, I mean, there's the traditional diagnoses that we see when I talk about depression, or when you see someone who has an official diagnosis. But trauma has a real deep impact when you see violence, when you see the aftermath of that. One of the things that we do, because you make a very valid point, even for those who fall in that 7 to 14 year line, I need to see those files. We had a case where a 19-year-old was charged with a gruesome homicide in South Shore. And when I hear on the news this person had an extensive background, if you're 19 with an extensive background, my guess is that you have a juvenile history. So I want to look at that juvenile history. How many times have we touched you? You stole your first car at 12? What happened there? If we don't do a diagnosis of ourselves, of the system, if we don't sit down and do, forgive me for the inarticulation of saying a post-mortem, if we just process cases and not look at where did we touch them, where should we intervene, what worked, what didn't work, we're still going to keep these cycles going. And we're not going to be able to say what are the appropriate interventions. Because girls are a perfect example, and there's a willingness to talk about girls much more than it is to talk about boys in trauma. You talk about girls in trauma, and you look at the significant portion of them that have been sexually abused in their life, the significant portion of them who have been sexually abused who end up in the delinquency system. There's a level of empathy, until she slashed somebody's face. And then you're like, well, you slashed someone's face, and then we find out that you're acting out as a result of these other things. We do that for girls that we don't do for boys. And even when we do it for girls, we still sentence them as though we don't know what we know. And so I think that autopsy, if you will, of the systems and how we intervene, particularly as it relates to diagnosed and undiagnosed, slowing the process down and see who these people are, is critical. And we haven't done that in a meaningful way, and we're trying to do that now.
Thank you so much.
You should have submitted 2 cards. The next question is from Angela Waller at Laredo Hospital. She asks, and this question is for you, State's Attorney Foxx. Your election win was fueled by a very unfortunate event that frustrated a large number of people, frustrated them enough to vote. How do we continue to influence individuals to exercise their civic rights and duties beyond adverse events?
That's a great question. I certainly, it's funny because I've been grappling with that. I was running for this office before the tragic events of November of 2015 on looking at our criminal justice system, the disparities that we saw in our juvenile justice system, how it impacts communities of color. I worked at juvenile for almost 10 years as a state's attorney, 3 years as a public guardian, and that building is filled with babies that look like us. And I would always be surprised that people weren't out there protesting what was happening to the children who were in those buildings. And that's why I ran, because all of that connects to what we're seeing. And what ended up happening, even with my race, it became about one issue. And I will talk about that issue all day, every day, as it relates to accountability for those in law enforcement and what we need to do. But if we don't have real conversations about how all of this impacts us, like I said, whether it's about the budget, whether it's about schools, whether it's about how we fund, and we wait for that trigger moment and then get complacent, it's how you end up with really bad policy for decades. Like the way that we're looking at police accountability now and the conversations around consent decrees and the DOJ coming, Laquan McDonald wasn't the first person to die at the hands of police. We have the first of its kind police torture reparations.
That's right.
Why do we have reparations? Because for decades this has been happening. And so this isn't new. And the onus is on us to not wait for that one tipping point moment and then go away. Because in the name of those who have been hurt or harmed by systems, by egregious things that have happened, there's a guilt that I think I felt, quite honestly, when I decided to run for this against the odds. That if we don't stand up and say something, without something having happened, and just react to what we get what we get. And I think we've gotten what we've gotten, but I don't know how to keep it sustained. I don't want to keep it sustained by hashtags. I don't want to keep it sustained by children watching people get killed in front of them. I don't want to keep it sustained by talking about mass incarceration and just talking about mass incarceration. That's right. So I'm hopeful that this new level of activism that we see now, that this new level of wokeness that we talk about, that we can match that with action, that we can match it beyond rhetoric and match it with policy.
Next question comes from Donna Gutman. How do we strengthen the relationships between community police, ensuring that the community is kept in the forefront of this endeavor?
I think what's really important about that is to recognize that we have a police culture problem. We just do. It's not the only problem that we're facing, but it is one that has to be acknowledged. And I do feel strongly that it's not going to change unless we have someone externally monitoring the changes that need to be made as were recommended by the Department of Justice and the Police Accountability Task Force, and that they are implemented, and that we talk about it. And one of the good things that I think that Superintendent Johnson has acknowledged that Gary McCarthy did not was that we cannot allow for implicit bias to be an excuse for bad behavior. And so there has to be a concerted effort in terms of police training and in terms of police mental health. Both of these factors need to be acknowledged and addressed so that we can make changes in our police department. So until that is acknowledged and addressed, it's hard for me to put the onus on the communities that are being policed solely. There will have to be some trust built, and it has to be built with those measures in place.
The next question is from Dr. Selwyn Rogers. You wrote a paragraph, but we get through it anyway. It says a struggle. Given the enormity of gun violence, we need multi-level, aligned strategic plans across sectors, including education, employment, health, government, and non-governmental organizations. How can we break the barriers and silos to make sustainable impact?
You know, I think from the government standpoint, there has been a reluctance to have others come in and see what you're doing, to talk about what you're doing. And not all of it was nefarious, right? You know, I work for a prosecutor's office. I work with lawyers whose job it is to prosecute cases. So when we talk about, you know, research around, for example, adolescent brain development, you tell someone whose job it is to prosecute young people, you know, hey, it looks like the science says that young people's brains aren't functioning in the way that you think they are to the standards that we're holding them to. And it's like, you don't know what you're talking about. And there's an entrenchment in systems like that, right? I'm a lawyer, I do law. You're a doctor, you do medicine. You don't know anything about what I know.
But I'm a parent of teenagers.
Exactly. And that's, parent boys, bless your heart. But that's, there's the silo mentality because there has not been that link.
Right.
You know, we don't, historically you hadn't had prosecutors talking about economics and education and those influences. And quite honestly, the reason that I'm so comfortable talking about them is because it's a lived experience for me. And so my proximity to those issues means that I want to talk to people who do that work. And I will say, I think that there has been an evolution in some spaces of recognizing where medicine and health and public policy and outsiders should come together. It's clunky in trying to figure out how it works, but I think it starts with the acknowledgement by professionals, whether you're a lawyer or a doctor, that you don't know everything. And the humility to the work, which requires you to learn what you don't know and say what you don't know. And so I think there, it takes a certain level of humility of leadership to do that and then to continue to drive it. And so we've been very intentional about that, partnering with universities, whether it's the University of Chicago or Loyola or Northwestern, whether it's partnering with organizations that only do economic development or housing. We've been very intentional about saying we're open to what we have and being transparent with the data that we have. And that's what it takes. And the sad reality is that a lot of people haven't been raised that way, if you will. And we have to start requiring that. To Shari's point, what's the data? What's the evidence? I'm not a researcher, so I have to work with the researcher. And I think that's what it takes.
And I think there's another piece to this too, and it's an interesting notion that we really have to start to think about. Technology has created a world where things change so quickly. By the time we get to the policy that will change the issue that we're thinking about right now, the issue that we're thinking about right now doesn't even exist anymore. And so we have to be much more nimble and think much more creatively around how we work together to make sure that these problems get solved and quickly.
I want to acknowledge that both of you in a leadership position being I've known content, what you're saying, African American, are emblematic of leadership that we need to all of our communities. So thank you.
I always hate when people pronounce my name wrong, but the struggle for this one is real. I believe your first name is Anta.
Anta.
Spelman, okay, I was wrong. Spelman College Junior and a Chicago Defender intern.
Yes.
Get him, Anta. Get him, Anta.
When discussing economic destiny and ensuring wealth transfers throughout many generations, would you argue it to be important to place newly found emphasis on entrepreneurship in Chicago public schools?
I think entrepreneurship is critical at any age. I think that people need to know that they have the facility and ability to start businesses at a young age. And I think that some of the work that's being done at the Ariel Academy down the street in terms of how we look at teaching people about wealth and not just entrepreneurship, but wealth and keeping wealth and how you invest and what you do with wealth is critical to the stability and promotion of our community. So I agree. I think, yes, we should start teaching entrepreneurship and what that means and what a dollar means and how you invest it and where it goes from the very first moment that a child starts to think about that they have money.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the wealth management piece, because what I'll tell you, when people talk about entrepreneurship and the tech startups, I talk about the people who used to make icy cups on the 8th floor.
Come on now.
They would make a pitcher of Kool-Aid, they would pour it in a bunch of cups, they freeze it, then they sell it for like 25 cents. That's entrepreneurship. My grandmother sold Avon. You know, I used to do inventory for her. That's entrepreneurship. What we haven't taught, because our hustle, I call it the hustle economy. Our hustle game is strong. Is what do we do with the dollars that we generate? How do we spend that money? Is all of your income disposable? Are we saving that money? Are we pooling our resources? Do you have a skill set that's great that can add to this? Because I think we are a people of entrepreneurship. I mean, that has been in our nature from the beginning of time, trying to make that dollar out of 15 cents. The question becomes, how do we reinvest that? How do we reinvigorate communities with those dollars that we bring in? And I don't think that we've been systematically very intentional about teaching that to young people.
And just to insert another question, I got the idea from the woman over there. Just very, very quick. And it came to my head after hearing the doctor's question. I didn't get your last name. I don't want to be disrespectful. Dr. Rogers. And you spoke about unity across sectors to achieve the goals that we as a community set. But I want to pose the question to you all about unity amongst just ourselves first, because across those sectors, I think that we first have to realize that there needs to be Black unity across those sectors. Organizations like Jack and Jill don't come to communities on 79th Street to work with those community organizations. Jack and Jill financially withholds the amount to send so many disenfranchised youth to school, to etiquette classes, but they choose about 10 to 15 students from every prestigious high school. It's not fair and it's not okay. So if we're going to have conversations about unity across sectors, and if we're going to pose questions about unity within ourselves, Asian communities, Hispanic communities, white communities, we have to first address unity amongst ourselves because we do not have it.
I mean, I think it's unfortunate that we as a community harbor a lot of self-hatred. And so this is a real big issue for us to start to think about in and of ourselves. How do we stop that? And part of that is changing the narrative about who and what we are. And you know, as we witnessed earlier, there's a lot of people who think that we've degenerated ourselves into being who we are and we deserve what we have gotten. But we have to now start to think about the fact that that's not true, and we know it's not true. And how do we start to change that narrative so that we can start to feel the pride that we always have had in our lives?
And I would just say, because yes, as you can see, I was very earlier rooted in my own experience. We are not a monolith, right? My experience growing up as a child of a single mother in the projects is a very different experience than my 14-year-old daughter who has two parents who live in a nice house and she's a lawyer. And my day-to-day and what is important for me day-to-day is very different than what it was for my mom. And it's not that I don't care about the struggles that are happening. People tend to be surrounded by what's happening to them in the right now. And I think for organizations like a Jack and Jill or whomever, there was a purpose of it. And so it's not necessarily that it was bad. It's that community communing amongst themselves and feeling charitable that they would share with others. And so I think we also have to be mindful that even the differences among us don't make us bad. Right. Even the differences among us in perspectives don't mean that they are wrong. Right. It just means that their reality is different than ours. There's a weirdness to living in two worlds, the child of the projects and the lawyer of the suburbs. Come on. And I've seen the different flows of it. So some of it is hate. Some of it is just like you may not know someone that lives in New Trier and they're not even thinking about what's happening over here because they're trying to live their own lives. But I do think we have to be careful, particularly, and I'm going to be selfish, in Black leadership, in that we turn really quickly on each other if we don't feel that the results aren't fast enough. And I'm being selfish, because I've been in our job 6 months. It's
So you know.
So I know. And that frustration of the systems have been failing us for years, and you said you were going to do it, and now you don't care. I think we have to invest in organizations like the Urban League and invest in other, leaderships. Dr. Rogers is taking on a job. The fight to get the trauma center was hard enough. Now you got a brother leading it.
Well,
We have to support that because he brings, as a doctor, a perspective that maybe we wouldn't have otherwise had. And so that unity around not just kind of, the classes, because I think we probably all have the same heart, but our day-to-day may be different. But we have to find ways to be supportive of leadership. And if they don't know about what's happening in your neighborhood, it's not because they don't like them or love them. They may just not know. And so the onus is on us to bridge that amongst ourselves and not assume the worst of ourselves.
that's good.
Because some of you guys' questions were very much encircled around political advocacy, what it takes to get more people to actually go to the polls in order to get some of the things that we need to reduce gun and gang violence. I did want to take time to acknowledge a couple of other people in the room. First off, congratulations to our new Chicago Votes Executive Director, Stevie Vallis. Those who don't know him. Also, we have with us 20th Ward Committeeman Kevin Bailey. And because we're running a little short on time, we have one final question before we go into closing remarks. And that question is from Dr. Abdul. What can the state's attorney's office do to address the trauma and cycle of violence that impacts individuals, familiar and communities exposed to high levels of violence? Families, and communities exposed to high levels of violence.
You already answered that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm pleased to hear that.
I answered it already? Yeah. I just a quick summary of it. We are reactionaries. We have to be able to recognize that prevention helps me do my job better. So we have to invest, and we have limited dollars, but we know that organizations who do work, we can write or help write grants. We can sign letters of support. We can steer folks to these organizations, but we have to acknowledge the role that trauma and mental health plays, and not speak it just in mitigation, but in prevention. And that's what the role of our office can do. Again, we're lawyers, that's not our expertise, but we have to recognize that expertise is out there and it matters, and not feign ignorance to it in the decisions and policies that we make.
Thank you all for being here. Before we close, we want to make sure that we give a few moments for both CEO Shari Runner of the Urban League as well as Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx to give their closing remarks. And we'll start with you, Ms. Runner.
What I think we've talked about a lot tonight. We've discussed a lot of different things, but I think it's really important for us to acknowledge two things that we all can do individually as we start to think about solutions. One is start to talk to people who don't look or think or act like you, and start to have those civilized conversations with people so that you can express your point of view and they can tell you their point of view, and we can start to develop some understanding amongst ourselves. That's one thing. The other thing is get out. Get out in the streets of your neighborhoods, walk around, talk to people, know your neighbors, be visible, do what you need to do to make sure that everybody knows in your neighborhood individually that you're there and that you care and that you want to be a part of it. And so we're doing street teams. Once a week we go out and walk the streets of Bronzeville to let people know that the Urban League is here and what we do. And we'd be happy to have any and all of you join us to do that walking, just so that people know that there are people who are in these neighborhoods who care and want something different for themselves and their lives. So those are things that I think about that we individually can do rather than trying to change a system without having the grassroots effort.
I just want us to, in all of these conversations, remember I listed some statistics at the beginning, that those are people, those are families, those are communities that have lost lives. There's a generation that has been cut off. And I feel like in these conversations when we're talking, that we have to be rooted in the fact that the devastation that is happening to our city has a real impact. I talked, as I said, to a mom who lost her son, who was a friend of mine in college, and she wasn't talking to me just as the state's attorney, she was talking to me as her friend, and then she talked to me as the state's attorney and said, they don't know who did this. We cannot allow the violence that we see in our neighborhoods. We got the systems piece that we have to deal with, but we have people who are harming our families, who are harming our children among us. And it's the difficult conversation that we don't like to have. When we saw those two 12-year-olds who were shot within the span of 3 days back in February, there was a rallying. 11 and 12, thank you. We have to rally. And it can't just be because those that we value as the most vulnerable garner our attention that we have to do something. Right. We can't do that. Because for a 19-year-old who maybe they got a little bass in their voice or a tattoo on their face, somebody's child, that is somebody's child. Yes. That is somebody's father. And we can't allow this to happen. And it just can't be the 78-year-old man who's crossing the street and we get outraged because it's an older person, an elder. There were children, and it breaks my heart, on a field day, right, at school. That we have to be outraged by that too. We have to be outraged by that too. And so, to Shari's point about getting out there, we have to speak up that this is not acceptable, that this is not the norm. This should not be what we come to expect, that our children cannot play and thrive. When you talk about thriving, when you talk about the ability to be productive citizens, if you can't even go outside, you are cutting yourselves off from opportunities that other children who are on their way to violin lessons, who are on their way to the park to work on their soccer game or their track game, we are disadvantaging ourselves, and we can't do it in the name of fear. Right. I'm doing my best to make sure that people trust our system, and it's going to take a really, really, really long time to do that, and it can't just be me. I just can't do it. But we have, well, I appreciate that, but it is just 6 months. Centuries of work. But we have to not allow that level of distrust to cause further harm to our communities. We can't do that. We cannot accept that. So what I would say to many of you, if you see something, you got to say something. You got to say something. Because to the point that the officer made earlier, I couldn't do something across the street and people knew my grandmother, and it didn't get back by the time I got to the 8th floor. And I know that we can't do it in the same way that we did it back in the day. In fact, I advise you not to. But we have to continue to be our brothers and sisters keepers. And I will also say, you know, to the point that was made earlier, we can't write off the people who've been killed as we feel somehow safer if we're gang related, that it can't be us. We have to love them to the same degree that we love the most vulnerable. And then lastly, go at it where you are. It is big, it is centuries old, but start with where you are. People always tell me, what do I need to do? If you're not good with children, don't try to be a mentor. But if you are good at, you know, going and helping collect clothes for women who are living in battered women's shelters, if you have a closet full of stuff that you can't use, if it's about mental health, you know, there are opportunities that you can volunteer at some of the smaller agencies that we have. If it's about education, show up at the Board of Education meetings. If it's about public health, you know, and mental health, show up and make sure that the trauma center and the folks are doing what they need to do. Whatever your skill set is, this is an all hands on deck problem. And if you think the only hands that should be on the deck are in law enforcement, then you are missing out. And so wherever your space is, whatever you are good, whatever, as the elders say, whatever your ministry is, you need to take up your ministry and use it wherever that may be. And some of the good work, Dr. Abdul is doing in the Southland, that wasn't because she got a ton of money and a ton of folks, it's because she cared.
Right.
And if you care, put your time, talent, and treasure where your heart is, and I think we'll start to see real change.
Very good.